Certainly. Item number 1, the Trenton Transit Center and Intersection Improvements Public Information Center. The primary purpose of the Trenton Transit Center Circulation Improvements Local Concept Development Study is to develop and evaluate conceptual alternatives to enhance circulation, particularly for pedestrians and bicyclists to, from, and through the transit center area, and select a preferred alternative to advance the design. This Public Information Center meeting is being held to solicit public feedback on the alternatives that have been developed as part of this process. The following 3 alternatives were developed. Alternative 1, Market Street Road Diet. Alternative 2, Market Street Road Diet with S, South Clinton Avenue pedestrian/bicycle/transit only street. Alternative 3, roundabouts. All three alternatives were evaluated and are being presented to the project stakeholders in the community during the second virtual Public Information Center. However, alternative 3 will no longer be considered due to several fatal flaws related to the proposed roundabout. Thus, only alternatives 1 and 2 will be considered further for the selection of a preliminary preferred alternative. On this evening, April 22nd, 2021 at 6:16 p.m.
Thank you, Cherry. Are we turning it over to Adam, or who's presenting?
We want to start with Jeff and a quick word at the beginning of the presentation, and then we can jump in.
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. Good evening, everyone. I'm glad you all can make it. I'm Jeff Wilkerson, planner with the City of Trenton. We won't go through any introductions, but each person, as they present, will introduce themselves. Tonight's presentation, as Cherry just mentioned, is the second round of our public engagement efforts for this particular study, the Trenton Transit Center Area Circulation Improvement Concept Development Study. As mentioned, the purpose for tonight is to obtain public feedback on the study. And also mentioned, the purpose of the study is to help design road and intersection improvements for better circulation for all modes of travelers to, through, and from the transit center area, and improve safety for bicycle pedestrians in the area. The presentation will go into more details on the purpose of the project. Some of you may remember the Art Walk project that was presented last month in this area as well. Although this is not the same project, the 2 projects are conscious of each other and are meant to complement each other. During the presentation, if anyone is having difficulty with Teams, they can put a message in chat or call Hannah at 929-232-3174. And Hannah, you're going to put your number in the chat?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. And then I guess I'll give it over to Catherine.
No, Jeff. So first we need to hand it over to Jessica, who's going to make a short announcement for anybody who is here and would like a Spanish presentation.
Great, thank you, Adam. So gracias todos por unirse al Centro de Información Público para el Trenton Transit Center. Mi nombre es Jessica Ortiz. Voy a facilitar la parte en español de esta presentación. Por favor, ten en cuenta que esta noche estamos ofreciendo esta presentación totalmente en español, en una sala virtual separada. Si quiere unirse a esa sala, levante la mano haciendo el clic en el icono pequeño en la esquina superior de su pantalla, a la derecha. Esto hará saber a nuestro personal técnico que a usted le gustaría unirse a nuestra sala virtual en español. Muchísimas gracias. So I'll hand it back to Adam.
Thank you, Jessica. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your time this evening. Really excited to be here presenting this project and the alternatives that we've developed, and we hope to have some good discussion at the end of the presentation. Before we begin the presentation, we're going to just go through some of the different control options for how to use Teams if you're new to using Teams for a meeting. And I don't know if Hannah, you want to read through these?
Sure.
Take it away.
I will read through these, and you can just keep clicking away. My name, everyone, good evening, is Hannah Brockhouse. I'm a transportation planner with FHI Studio, and we are helping with this meeting. So for those of you who may be less familiar with Teams compared to other, Zoom and all of these other tools, it works very similar. The volume control is down on your bottom left or top right, depending on how recently you updated the app. And you can also click to see the question and answers in the chat bar, where we'll encourage you to be submitting your questions during the presentation and afterwards. When you do that, you'll see a little chat bar in the bottom right-hand corner where you can put in those comments and hit submit. And we just wanted to remind folks that there are further instructions in the chat and here in case anyone is joining late. Spanish interpretation is available during this meeting. And if you raise your hand or if you put anything in the chat, we'll get you into an interpretation room, which will be on the next slide. You'll be moved into a breakout room. And we'll bring everybody back before the question and answer portion of the meeting. Okay,
Thank you.
I think that's the end.
Thanks, Hannah. Before we get in, another step before we get in the presentation is instructions for the live polling we'll be utilizing during the presentation. So we'll be asking a few questions throughout the presentation. And there's two ways to join that live polling. I'm going to put in the chat a link. So if you're on a computer, your best bet is to click on that link or copy and paste it into a web browser. And that's going to open up a separate window. And as we get through the presentation, you'll see questions on the screen. Those same questions will appear on your presentation window, and you'll be able to answer those questions that way. And then we'll see in real time as we're going through the presentation, we'll be able to see those pop up on the screen. And you won't see anything, or you shouldn't see anything until the poll question appears during the presentation. You may also join using your phone. So you can text Trenton Trans, that's TRANS 970 to 22333. If you only have to do that once, that's going to link that number to the presentation. And then when the poll questions appear on the screen and during the presentation, you simply just need to then stay in the same chat window and just chat your answer, or text your answer in that text window. So take a moment if you want to do, I'm going to give everybody a minute to go ahead and do one of those two things, either open a web browser or to try to connect via their phone. If anybody has any issues accessing either one of those options, feel free to message us in the chat and somebody can help you navigate that. Also, when you do enter the website, at least you will get you can put your name in. You don't have to put your name in if you prefer to be anonymous. So while people are doing that, I'm going to open the first kind of icebreaker question. So the first question is, did you attend the first Public Information Center held in September 2020? So if you have your web browser open, you should see that question. You can just click on yes or no. If you join by phone, you can either text A for yes or B for no. And hopefully people will begin populating that and we'll be able to see that on the screen. Are people able to see that on their web browser?
A different question has appeared and I can't get rid of it. I've already answered it.
Okay, hold on one second. What I'm going to do is exit out of the presentation real quick, because it should be displaying, it should not be displaying, it shouldn't have displayed any questions. So let me just reset the poll everywhere for a minute and then we can jump back in. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. And hopefully that will help to reset the poll everywhere.
I see the correct question now.
Okay, great. Thank you. There we go. I'll just give everybody a minute, but I think for most part, I've seen most folks.
Adam,
not.
I just don't see your screen yet.
Oh, I'm sorry. I started the presentation, but I did not hit the screen. There.
There we go.
Technology. There we go. And for those, for anybody that's joined late, the instructions are actually at the top of the slide. You can go ahead and answer. I'm going to actually move on to the next slide to kick off.
Adam, can we hold on 1 second as we let people sort of figure out how to get this? There's a couple of questions that are coming up.
Okay, no problem.
Thanks. So for people who are joining now, you should be able to see the website at the top of the screen, polev.com/Trenton Trans 970, or you can text Trenton Trans 970 to that number, and it'll start the process.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think we can start moving forward.
Okay, thanks, Adam. So for
Adam,
those,
I'm sorry.
yes.
Just real quickly, did we make an announcement about questions in the process?
This is Hannah. We included some information about how to access the Q&A bar. We're going to have a period for comments at the end of the presentation, and we're going to have more detailed instructions on how to make those comments at the end of Adam's presentation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so
Great.
please,
so if people...
Go ahead, Adam.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, if people have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to enter them into the chat as we're going along, and we'll be collecting those as we go and feeding them to Adam at the end of the presentation. Thanks, Adam.
Okay, thank you. So for those who weren't involved in the first meeting, I just wanted to give everybody a quick background on the project before we start talking about the alternatives, which is kind of the main focus of today's presentation. The purpose and need of the study is to enhance circulation and safety, particularly for pedestrians and bicyclists to, from, and through the transit center area. And some of our needs are improving pedestrian and bicycle access and safety by filling in gaps and providing infrastructure for those modes, enhancing vehicular circulation by improving connectivity and eliminating complex intersections, eliminating or reducing free ramp movements. And when I talk about a free ramp movements, if you think of those ramps that are on Barlow Street that connect up onto Route 1, and those are, free flow ramp movements. The vehicles are just coming across. They're not signal controlled or controlled by a stop sign. They're just crossing. They're just moving freely. Support transit-oriented development around the transit center area and create a gateway for the city. This is a main entry point for many folks. Residents are using the city use this location on a daily basis. So do commuters and visitors. And so having the transit center and the area, then the study area, be a gateway for the city is another important need for this project. The study area is shown in blue. It's mainly focused on the seven main intersections within the study area, but we also recognized throughout the study process that it's not just about the intersections, it's how we interconnect them, particularly when we're talking about pedestrian and bicycle improvements. So we're really covering the entire study area that you see here. The project started back in December, at the end of December 2019. In August and September of 2020, we had the first round of stakeholder and public outreach. We had a virtual public information center in September. From there, we took that information and started developing and analyzing alternatives. We met with our NJDOT subject matter experts in February. That's because this is a process that's part of the NJDOT project delivery process, in which a project goes through concept development and then ultimately into preliminary engineering and final design so that it can move into implementation. So that's a pretty important step. We had a week or two ago, we had our local officials and stakeholders meetings, and now we're here with you all this evening for our Public Information Center number 2. So this is the one where we're trying to get feedback on the alternatives that you'll see coming up in the presentation, have a discussion. That discussion will help us to select features of the alternatives that the public and others are in support of, to develop ultimately a preliminary preferred alternative. And that's important. We need a preferred alternative, and then in order to advance it through the project delivery process. Another poll question. Hopefully this one works better than the first one. You can, if you're using your browser, you can answer by clicking on the answer. How do you usually get to the Trenton Transit Center? And if you're using your phone, you just text the letter. You don't have to text the whole word. Just text the letter that corresponds to each to the potential answer that you want to input. I'll give everybody a minute.
To those of us who are joining us and have not done this, the web address to participate is at the top of the screen. It's pollev.com/TrentonTrans970. Or you can text Trenton Trans 970 222333 to participate. And Jessica's put that information in the chat.
Jessica and Adam, do we want to make, since we have some folks that are arriving after the start, do we want to make another announcement about the Spanish translation option real quick?
Sure, absolutely. Bienvenido a la presentación del centro. Bienvenido al Centro de Información Pública para el Trenton Transit Center. Mi nombre es Jessica Ortiz. Por favor, tenga en cuenta que vamos a hacer esta presentación totalmente en español en una sala virtual separada. Si quiere unirse a esa sala virtual, por favor, levante la mano haciendo clic en el icono de la mano en la esquina derecha de su pantalla, y eso hará saber que nuestro personal técnico sepa que quiere unirse a la sala en español. Muchísimas gracias por estar aquí esta noche. Okay.
Thank you. So you can see a lot of folks are walking and driving, not so many using other modes to the transit center. I'm not surprised that bike is relatively low, given that there aren't really any bicycle facilities right now. That's one of the problems we want to address as part of this study. And yeah, there's no bicycle parking in bicycle facilities. That's one of the things we hope that you will see coming up in the slides, that may help make it more easier for folks to bike or scooter to the transit center area. I'm going to move on to the next slide. So what did we learn during the first community and stakeholder outreach? I'm not going to read all of these bullets, but I'm going to highlight some of the key ones that I want to talk about. Implementation is critical. That's probably the number one thing we've heard from all the stakeholders, from the folks that were involved in the first Public Information Center. There's been a lot of studies in the area over the past 15 years, lots of recommendations, but not a project that was going to advance the recommendations to engineering and design. So one of the things we wanted to make sure that we were doing as part of this study was coming up with recommendations that were implementable and that had a plan for moving forward. Some of the other needs identified by the stakeholders include improving network connectivity, exploring roundabouts, connecting Barlow Street to Market Street, accommodating the future art walk, providing bike parking and bike potential for bike share, improving connectivity between transit modes, so between rail, light rail, bus, creating a gateway experience, and improving safety and security that includes lighting. Some other needs and opportunities that we identified through our own investigation. Obviously, there's no bicycle facilities. We have narrow sidewalks with gaps in coverage. There are long crossing distances at intersections, particularly those intersections on Market Street. There's excess vehicular capacity. We have lots of lanes, for example, on Market Street, but the volumes don't warrant as many lanes as we have, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. Some other issues pictured in the top right, we see we have a very heavy truck volume of trucks that are coming off of Route 1, turning onto Market Street to ultimately get to Stockton and then get back onto 129 to head over to, ultimately, most of them are trying to get over towards the Turnpike. We have signal equipment and ADA curb ramp upgrades that need to be made. Here's an example of some of that in the middle picture. And also another key issue that we identified was the southbound bus stop on Clinton Avenue, right in front of the transit center. You can see here in the picture that bus blocks the travel lane. Vehicles have to go around it, which makes it, and vehicles that want to continue through the intersection or turn right, they're having to turn in front of the bus. It's just, there's just a lot of conflict that bus stop introduces. So that's something we also wanted to try to address. We collected traffic volume data in January of 2020, so before the pandemic hit and we had everything shut down, and we analyzed existing conditions at the intersections. This shows overall level of service, and level of service is a kind of like a report card grade, where A means the intersection is operating with very minimal congestion, and an F would mean that the intersection is operating with a lot of congestion. So as you can see here, most of the intersections that we're studying as part of this study are level service C or better for the AM peak, so the AM commuter, and the PM typical weekday commuter peak hour. And what that's really highlighting to us is that, you know, we have a lot of excess capacity that could potentially be reclaimed for pedestrians and bicyclists. When we're talking about level of service in the peak hour of in an urban environment, pretty much level of service D is considered, anything A to D is considered good. Level service E is usually considered not so great, and level service F is typically considered failing. So the fact that we have a lot of wiggle room with our level of service and our operations of the study area roadway network, that goes a long way to helping us accommodate some other modes on the roadways. Also looking at crashes during the study period, what I really want to highlight on this slide is the pedestrian crashes that are occurring within the area of the transit center. That really is highlighting that we do need to think about pedestrian safety and how we can enhance pedestrian safety at intersections as people are trying to get to the transit center or just through the transit center area. So now let's get into talking about the alternatives. We have three guiding principles for the alternatives. The first guiding principle is to make the alternatives feasible. One of the things that the other studies didn't really focus on was making sure that the recommendations were geometrically, operationally feasible for the roadway network. So that's one thing that we wanted to do with the alternatives and recommendations we developed as part of this study. The second guiding principle was implementable. So we wanted to make sure that what we were doing, we're going to limit right of way. That's ROW is right of way. That's essentially property impacts. So we didn't want to have property impacts unless absolutely necessary. We wanted to minimize environmental and stormwater impacts as well, because all property, environmental, and stormwater impacts can have significant costs associated with them, as well as extend the amount of time that it takes to actually get a project implemented. As a result, we came up with 3 alternatives. The Market Street Road Diet. Alternative 2 is Market Street Road Diet with a transit, pedestrian, and bicycle only street on South Clinton Avenue. And alternative 3, which is road diets with roundabouts. Before I showcase the alternatives, we're going to talk about terminology, particularly around bicycle facilities that I'm going to talk about that you might hear me say during the presentation. The first one you'll hear me talk a lot about is protected bike lanes. So if you can see my cursor, that's an example of a protected bike lane where we have the bike lane along the curb, and there's usually either a barrier or a striped area or even parking that separates the bike lane from the travel way. It's very, it helps bicyclists feel more comfortable. Wider variety of bicycle level riders are able to use this because they feel more separated. So novice riders typically tend to be more comfortable with a protected bike lane configuration. We have bike boxes, both 2-stage and 1-stage bike boxes. These are at intersections to help bicyclists. Let's say they're coming down the bike lane and they want to turn to get onto another street. These are areas where bicyclists can wait safely in order to make the turns. High visibility crosswalks are another thing you'll hear me say. This is an example of one. Painted curb extensions. So one of the things that we can do to reduce crossing distances at intersections is extend the end of the curb, providing more of a protected area for pedestrians. It brings them out so that they're more visible to drivers, and also shortens the actual distance that they're crossing on the roadway. And you can do them with curbing, or in this case, you can do them with just paint. I've seen them done with artwork, other different colors. So there's a lot of different opportunities, and they can be protected by these flexible delineators, which kind of outline for the drivers where they should not be driving. I've also seen planters and other things like that for these types of pedestrian areas. Another term you'll hear a lot today is super sharrow. Super sharrow is essentially a symbol that's in the travel lane that's got a green background that lets drivers know that bicyclists may be traveling in the travel lane. These are used in areas where we want to have bicycle activity, but we don't have the space to provide a bicycle lane. And then finally, a raised intersection. You can see an example of one in this picture. This is basically what we do is the intersection, if you're driving, the intersection is actually raised. So you have to slow down to drive through the intersection, and it also brings the pedestrians up higher, the cars up to the level and pedestrians at the same level so that they're more visible. There are several common recommendations common to all alternatives. I'm not going to read each one of these, but things like improved lighting, ADA accommodations, high visibility crosswalks, lead pedestrian intervals. So that's when the walk symbol at a traffic signal displays for a few seconds before the green light comes on, allows those pedestrians to begin crossing the street before vehicles are trying to turn across the crosswalk. Also upgrading signal equipment, improving wayfinding, so both for pedestrians and drivers, making it easier for them to know how to navigate around the transit center area. And once, if you're a pedestrian and you get off at the transit center, how do you get to some of the major destinations within the study area? So I'm not going to talk about these each individually, but with the alternatives, because they're common to all of the alternatives we'll be talking about today. I'm going to show an overview of the alternatives, and then we're going to zoom into the intersections and take a more detailed look. So alternative 1 includes a road diet on Market Street with bike lanes. Other feature of alternative 1 is connecting Barlow Street to Market Street. So right now, if you're leaving the transit center on Barlow Street, you're forced to go onto Route 1. So now you would be able to connect to Market Street. Parking remains on Clinton Avenue and State Street in this alternative as well. In alternative 2, it's a similar configuration on Market Street. We're relocating the ramps that go to Route 1 over to here, and we'll zoom in so that they're easier to see in a few slides. This section of Clinton Avenue between Barlow Street, where my cursor is, and Market Street would become a street only for buses, pedestrians, and bicyclists. Vehicles would be routed around on Market Street to Barlow Street and then back to Clinton Avenue as part of this alternative. The other key feature of this is providing bike lanes on State Street and Clinton Avenue in lieu of the parking that you saw in Alternative 1, and a realignment of Wallenberg Avenue. Alternative 3 includes 3 roundabouts. And what I'll say about Alternative 3 is that we're no longer considering Alternative 3 as part of this study. There were several issues, including property impacts, impacts to the structures over the creek, distance issues with particularly here at Stockton Street between the intersections, impacts to pedestrians. There's a variety of reasons why that we felt that these roundabouts were not feasible for this application, and therefore we are no longer going to consider Alternative 3 in the study, and actually for the rest of the presentation we'll only be focusing on Alternatives 1 and 2. So the first intersection I'm going to talk about is Stockton Street and Market Street over here on the left side of the study area. So zooming into that intersection, the general configuration of the intersection remains generally the same, except instead we're providing some protected bike lanes. We're formalizing, there is a very short bike lane that exists on Market Street. We're formalizing that as well. We're providing some paint for the pedestrian areas to make the crossing distances, particularly across this ramp, forcing vehicles to slow down and making that crossing distance a little shorter. As you can see, we have super sharrows here on the left side of the intersection. Right now, the study area for us ends at this intersection. However, there is a study done by DVRPC which recommends continuing the bike lanes along Market Street. So ultimately, we hope that that would actually be implemented, and then those sharrows would be bike lanes. So now we're going to take a street level view of what it would look like. So if you were standing on this yellow line, what would the configuration of the roadway look like? So the top shows the existing configuration and the bottom shows the proposed configuration. And both, in this case, this intersection, both of the configurations are the same in Alternatives 1 and 2. You can see features like wider sidewalks and the bike lanes that are provided. Moving further east on the corridor, now over to Barlow Street and the Barlow Street and Market Street intersection. Alternatives 1 and 2 are side by side here because they are different. So on the left side is Alternative 1. This slip ramp would be removed. Barlow Street would be brought into the intersection with Market Street, so providing access to Market Street. If you did happen to want to access Route 1, you would simply just turn right and use this section of the ramp here. You can see the road diet on Market Street. We've got fewer lanes in order to provide those protected bike lanes. In Alternative 2, both of the slip ramps that exist in this area are removed, and they're replaced with a new ramp in this area. And the reason why we have a new ramp here is because this actually will result in vehicles needing to turn slower across the pedestrian and bicycle area. That's providing a more visible condition for the pedestrians and bicyclists and slowing vehicles as they're turning before they then continue on the ramp. The other feature of this is the jug handle would be removed, and there'd actually be a left turn lane from Market Street directly onto Barlow Street. So instead of going around the jug handle, now you can make the left turn. Next, we'll move down to Greenwood. The Greenwood Avenue section of the study area. So in Alternative 1, there's a few features to talk about. The first is the channelized right turn that's on Clinton Avenue would be removed because now we have that connection to Barlow Street, so we no longer need to provide that. That actually helps us out a lot with controlling pedestrian conflicts. Greenwood Avenue would undergo a road diet where we'd have one travel lane in each direction with a center turn lane, and so that we can provide the protected bike lanes. And you can see some similar changes here at the Walnut Hudson Street intersection, where we would be providing more bicycle lane or bicycle facilities connecting up to the transit center area, that secondary entrance of the transit center, and providing a bus stop where that right turn lane used to be. In Alternative 2, it's a very similar configuration for Greenwood Avenue, but the only major difference in Alternative 2 is that this section of Clinton Avenue is now closed to vehicular traffic. It's only for pedestrians, bicyclists, and transit. If you were standing on this yellow line on the street, this is what existing conditions look like. You have 2 travel lanes in each direction now. And in the future, with the proposed alternatives 1 and 2 on Greenwood Avenue, you'd have the protected bike lanes with 1 travel lane in each direction with a center turn lane. Moving further up to South Clinton Avenue and Barlow Street. So this is the main intersection in front of the transit center area. I'm just going to talk about the zoomed in view on the right. You can kind of see what's happening on the left. The left is a wider view. The right is a more zoomed in view of the intersection. So we have recommendations for a raised intersection that can support some artwork that would help to make it easier and pedestrians more visible, have drivers slow down as they pass through the intersection. The other key part of this alternative is modifications to this area, this paved area here that provides access to the surface parking. We would maintain surface parking, we would maintain the access to the surface parking, but we would have a raised driveway so that pedestrians are more visible to the drivers as they're coming across, are more prominent, and drivers have to travel across that area more slowly. And then using some of that area to provide a bus or shuttle stop closer to the transit center area. And alternative 2, again, this is the north end of that pedestrian, transit, and bicycle only street. So the existing bus stop that's in this area would now be moved into the transit area. So it's taking it out of the travel lane, moving it into the transit only area. We're also able to modify the drop-off area for the transit center, extend it a little bit to provide more area for drop-off that's not going to conflict with the intersection. And then completely closing off this access to the surface parking to provide a larger drop-off area on the westbound Wallenberg Avenue, replacing access, providing a driveway to the surface parking lot on Clinton Avenue instead. And you can see that here we're providing protected bike lanes on this section of South Clinton Avenue. So what happens to vehicles if you want to travel on South Clinton Avenue in alternative 2? The path you would take is simply to turn on Market Street, to turn on to Barlow Street, and then continue on to Market Street. So we recognize that this alternative is certainly one that merits a lot of consideration. On one hand, you have the benefits to pedestrians, bicyclists, and transit users, particularly because we have a lot of transit user movement between the light rail station on one side of Clinton Avenue and the transit center on the other side. However, it does have impacts to vehicular circulation for vehicles that are traveling on Clinton Avenue. And we are maintaining in all of these alternatives, we're maintaining level of service D or better at all intersections, which is considered acceptable, but it is certainly a degradation from the level of service C that we're seeing at some of the intersections. So, it is a trade-off that definitely warrants some discussion, and I hope that we will have some discussion on that today to help give us, the project team, some more guidance. Here's an example. If you were standing on that section of Clinton Avenue in alternative 1, you would see how we can provide some protected bike lanes, but also some shadows, and because of the limited space that we have. In alternative 2, that's where we can provide some wider sidewalks, level bus boarding, and some bike facilities. This is in the pedestrian transit and bicycle only street alternative. So, of course, we want to ask a question about this one because it is something that we love to hear. So, based on your initial impression of this conversion, what do you think about it? Do you like it? Do you not like it? Do you need to think about it some more? Take a moment to complete the survey. So again, if you're on your computer, go to your browser window and go ahead and respond. If you're on your phone and you're texting your answer in, just text the letter next to the answer. You don't have to write the whole entire answer out if you're using your phone. And I'll just get everybody a minute to get their answers in. And if folks have questions on this, we can certainly, in the question and discussion period, have a more detailed discussion about this option and the potential impacts to drivers in particular, which I think is definitely going to be a concern of some. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Now we're going to talk about Clinton Avenue and State Street in that area. So in alternative one, we wanted to maintain the on-street parking. There were several comments brought up in the stakeholder outreach that this on-street parking is particularly important for people that want to access some of the agencies in this area. So we wanted to have an alternative where that's provided. However, we can't, we don't have enough room then to provide protected bike lanes. So in this case, we're using super sharrows, meaning that the bicyclists that are on Clinton Avenue would be traveling in the main travel lane. The other feature of this is we're able to provide left turn lanes on State Street to allow vehicles, to get vehicles that want to turn left from blocking the through vehicles. In alternative two, the on-street parking pretty much goes away except in front of the businesses here, kind of on the west side of the image. We do provide protected bike lanes throughout. On the north side of Clinton Avenue, on North Clinton Avenue, there's really not enough space. Anyway, so we're going back to super sharrows on that location as it exits our study area. So if you were standing on this yellow line on the street, this is an alternative one. The configuration would look like this at the top. And alternative two is what the configuration of the roadway would look like with the protected bike lanes rather than the parking. So another poll question, we want to hear from you guys about what do you think about removing on-street? Do you think we should keep the parking or remove the parking and provide the protected bike lanes, or you're not sure yet? You can answer C if you would like to think of, if you would need to consider it more. Give everybody a minute to get the answer in. Seems overwhelmingly that the right now, at least, that the protected bike lanes are the popular option. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. Our final last intersection to talk about is the five-leg intersection of Wallenberg and State Street, Wall Street, and Chestnut Street. So an alternative one, we're able, because the intersection, the roadway widens out, we're able to keep the travel lanes, but provide protected bike lanes. So we transition folks from the super sharrows into bike lanes to get through the intersection. We can also provide protected bike lanes on Wallenberg Avenue as well. As part of a separate project, Chestnut Avenue is planned sometime in the future. There's no exact timeline for this, part of a separate project, but the plan is to convert Chestnut Avenue to a pedestrian and bike only crossing over the railroad tracks. So that's why it's kind of shown as closed in this alternative. However, this alternative would work even if Chestnut Avenue remains open. Alternative two, we have Wallenberg Avenue is now moved from its current location, realigned. This is something that was a recommendation from the TOD plan to realign this intersection. It makes the intersection much more condensed and easier for pedestrians to cross. Similarly, it simplifies this the existing intersection as well. Without this leg coming in, we wouldn't necessarily need the traffic signal anymore, because Wall Street is actually one way away from the intersection. And so we would maintain a crossing here, could be maintained as a signalized crossing, or we could use things like rectangular rapid flashing beacons to maintain a crossing at this location to allow those residents that live on Wall Street to cross conveniently and still continue down to the transit center area. So when comparing alternatives 1 and 2, we evaluated each alternative on several metrics, including their impacts to pedestrians and bicyclists, transit, traffic operations, property, environmental, parking, and then the cost. And so if you see what you see highlighted in green is basically our opinion that this whatever alternative is highlighted in green for that metric does a better job. So for example, we feel that alternative 2 is a much better condition for bicyclists and pedestrians because of the fact that we're providing more bicycle lanes. We're providing more, we have that pedestrian transit and bicycle only street. However, if you look at traffic operations, alternative 1 for purely traffic operations does a slightly better job for managing operations because of just the fact that alternative 2 has that closure of Clinton Avenue. There's no property impacts on either alternative. We also don't anticipate any environmental impacts and just very minor stormwater management impacts for the additional pavement for wider sidewalks and for that Barlow Street connection. In terms of parking, we're losing an alternative 1. We're losing 18 on-street parking spaces on State Street. But in alternative 2, because we're removing the on-street parking to provide the protected bike lanes, we're losing 30 on-street parking spaces on Clinton Avenue and 65 on State Street. So there needs to be some discussion about how to manage that, how to mitigate that loss. Can we accommodate that with enhancing our options for off-street parking, especially for those that are only trying to park for a short term? Can we do something with a parking fee structure at the off-street garages, for example, that would help to facilitate more short-term parking? Order of magnitude cost estimates. So these are very high-level rounded cost estimates. For alternative 1 is $2.5 million and alternative 2 is $3.3 million. Oops. So there's going to be, we have 2 questions. The first one now is, considering the trade-offs, which of the proposed bicycle improvements should be prioritized for implementation? So for example, if you think super sharrows are fine, then you would select A. If you really think bike lanes are what we should be doing, select option B. There's other things like secured bicycle parking, bike share. If you don't think any bicycle facilities are needed, you can answer on letter F at the bottom. All right, I'm going to move on now that we've gotten a lot of responses. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the second question. The second question is basically a copy of the first, but now asking about pedestrian improvements. So what are some of the more critical, in your opinion, what are the most critical things that we should be focusing on when we're developing our preferred alternative in terms of pedestrians? Is it wider sidewalks and missing sidewalk segments, better crossing conditions, lead pedestrian intervals, improved lighting, pedestrian level wayfinding, or raised intersections? Give everybody a minute to go ahead and put in their answer. So we're saying shorter crossing distance and high visibility has moved definitely towards the majority, with wider sidewalks and improved lighting coming in and a tie at second place. So thank you for those responses. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next next slide. If you don't get a chance to respond for some reason, a technical issue, as we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, this presentation will be posted online, and there will be a survey link with these same questions. So if you want to go back and input your information into that survey, or if you're watching this online after the actual meeting, you can use that survey to go ahead and answer these questions that you see on the screen. Okay. So what are our next steps? So right now we're here trying to elicit feedback from the community to help us select a preliminary preferred alternative. And it could be pieces of either alternative. It doesn't have to be alternative 1 or alternative 2. It could be a little bit of a combination of both. But we're here to help us select that preliminary preferred alternative. After the meeting and the public comment period that follows this meeting, we will develop a preliminary preferred alternative plan and then post it to the project website, which is on the right, and then elicit any final comments from the public and then complete and submit the concept development study document. As we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this is the first step in NJDOT's project process. You have a concept, we select a preliminary preferred alternative, then ultimately it gets moved into preliminary engineering, final design, and construction. So after this study, we're going to work towards securing funding sources for that preliminary engineering, final design, and construction. And I understand that the city and DVRPC are already working on getting money secured in the TIP, which is the program that the budget for upcoming projects. So once that funding is secured, it would be the preliminary preferred alternative goes to engineering and design, and then ultimately to construction. Right. The ultimate goal here of this project is to have something that will move forward and get implemented. And I think the alternatives that we've come up with, in that they all basically are changes within the existing pavement area. So we're not widening roadways or anything. We're using the existing space and just reallocating the resources will help to hopefully make it easier to implement.